This is a story called Blood and Peaches. It's about my grandma Arms. Um, I think I kind of inherited her nose. Um, I didn't really know her in her prime. She was getting up there in years. At least my memory of her, I think of her as an old lady. Her life took a big turn, an unfortunate turn, when one day she fell off her back porch and broke her hip. Um, and that was before they did all these hip replacement surgeries, and so that accident turned her into a semi-invalid. My grandfather cared for her. She'd wake up every day at the crack of noon. She was a late riser. She liked to stay up late and watch Jack Parr and Johnny Carson's Tonight Show and things like that. So she'd sleep late. And my grandpa was an early riser, though he liked to get up and do stuff downstairs. And but she'd wake up at the crack of noon, and she had a cane, and so she'd pound. She'd lay there in bed, and she'd pound on the floor with that cane, bam, bam, And my grandpa would come up and take care of her. And if he was slow, she had a big bell, and she'd pick up the bell, wang, 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 until up he came, see what the trouble was, and. He'd help her out of bed and get her over there into the bathtub and give her a bath. And the way it was on from the second floor where the bedroom was, and she had to come downstairs, and he couldn't carry her. I mean, she's a big woman, so she'd scoot down from step to step to step on her butt until she got down to the bottom, and then she'd yell, and he'd come and he'd help her, and she'd use her cane. She had two canes, and she'd get over there to her chair. Her chair was like a throne. It was a big swivel chair, and there was a telephone right there, so she could call people up. And another little table with her like her puzzle books and her Bible and that kind of thing. And of course, it aimed right at the TV. She loved to watch TV. She liked game shows, and soap operas, and that was her day. She'd yell orders all day long at my grandpa, and my grandfather would, cheerfully, he would carry out these orders. She gave a very detailed. Seemed like her orders got more impossibly detailed and persnickety the older she got, and he would do his darndest. I remember one time she lost a thimble. Apparently, a thimble she'd had since she was 12 years old, given to her by her mother, her so she claimed, and she lost it. She needed that when she darned socks, and my grandpa would buy new thimbles. He'd bring them home, and these thimbles would never be right. They'd be the wrong size, or they had wrong pattern on them, or they hurt my finger, Gary. They hurt my finger. Why does he want to hurt my finger? She seemed to imagine he wanted to hurt her finger. I bet he bought her 15, 18, 19 thimbles, trying to find the perfect thimble. She would kind of take this amused interest in me, and always in things that were wrong with me, my various imperfections, my greasy forehead, and my pimples, and my hair was too long, she thought, and she would make me promise on the Bible that I would never smoke or drink, or of course, I broke all these promises. My grandma pretty well convinced me that I'm ugly and dishonest and, kind of evil in my tastes. And despite all that, I loved my grandma. And I think it was because she was a storyteller. Um, Storytellers tend to pounce on grotesque details. Especially when they're embarrassing and horrific. And I'm the same way. She loved to tell stories. I inherited that. We tend to say things that are a little inappropriate in the hopes that they will stick in the mind of the listener. Anyway, this is a story I heard her tell this story 100 times. It's the story of her husband's death, the death of the Reverend Clinton Arms. Well, after more than 50 years of marriage, uh, she, she woke up one day. She'd kind of tell this almost like it was a story about somebody else. And, she pounded on the floor with her cane the way she always did, and nothing happened. And Grandpa didn't come, and pound, pound, pound. Where is he? And she got that bell, and clang, 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 and he didn't come. She'd listen, and she couldn't hear anything down there. And clang, 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 and he just didn't come. And so she had to get out of bed in her nightgown, drag herself out of bed and fall and scoot on the floor, and ouch, ouch, her hip, oh, it hurts. And then she had to kind of slide herself down all those steps, and she turned it into this elaborate story. It was like climbing Mount Everest in reverse, and oh, it hurt, and oh, that third step, and oh, it hurt, and until she finally got to the bottom, and she yelled, and he didn't come, and she went in the living room and she couldn't see him anywhere, and she dragged herself across the carpet and up into her chair, up into that throne, and yelled, and he didn't come, and she knew he had to. He would tell her if he was going to go anywhere, and so she called up the neighbor. The neighbor was named Sam. And she got on the phone and she told him, just come on in. Don't just come on in through the back door. And so Sam did, and he comes and and he's looking around. He can't find Grandpa, and finally he decides he'll go down into the basement. And he goes down, and Grandma said she just listened, trying to hear something. And finally he comes back. She hears the footsteps of Sam as he comes closer and closer, and there he is, and he just stands in front of her, and he doesn't say anything. And finally Grandma said, is he gone, Sam? And she would imitate the expression on Sam's face, and Sam would just nod his head. Grandpa was gone. And it turned out, it took her a while, I guess, to figure out what all happened. But Grandpa had gotten up early, as he liked to do, and he canned peaches. That was one of the many things he liked to do in the kitchen. He'd go buy a bunch of damaged peaches, and he'd cut out the bruises, and he'd boil them, and I don't know what all you do. And you put them in these glass jars. I forget, what do they call it? Ball jars? Anyway, mason jars? I don't know. Anyway, and he had a whole big box full of these jars of peaches, and he was going to take them down into the basement and store them down there in the basement. And the grandma could tell this story with so much force that I could just see my grandfather. I could see his balding forehead and his wire rimmed glasses, and I could see that carton full of cans of peach, or jars of peaches, and the heavy sweet syrup. And anyway, he started down this narrow stairway into the basement, not very well lit basement, and he must have tripped. He must have lost his footing and pitched forward, and flung those peaches out in front of him, and down he goes. And there's a big freezer. They've got there's a foot of the steps, and there's just a little space in the corner, and there they got a freezer, and his head just crashed right into that freezer. And my grandma would say, Gary, I don't think he ever regained consciousness. And he, died down there. He bled to death before anybody found him, in a pool of blood and peaches. Well, after that, we had to move her to our nursing home. Nobody who could take care of her. She needed a lot of care, and she became kind of a hoarder. She had all that stuff, big two-story house with a basement and a big attic, and we had to reduce it to the amount of things that could fit into two rooms in a nursing home. And she turned into the kind of old lady that was always yelling at nurses and accusing her at the nurse aides, the helpers, and you're stealing. I know you stole. And oh, it was. I see now she was slowly descending into dementia. Um, Finally, she had to move out of the two rooms and into the nursing wing, and she got where she didn't know who I was, and she didn't know anyone in the family except for my dad. Except she thought my dad, after a while, she thought my dad was her husband. And she would talk to him like he was her husband, and he would kind of go along with this. And then finally she thought he was her father. And I remember one time I saw her, and she was holding my dad's hand, and she said, Papa, I'm a good girl. Don't you think I'm a good girl? She seemed really worried, and my dad said, oh, don't worry, honey, you're a good girl. You're a good girl. She loved to tell that story long after she was deep in dementia, the story of my grandfather's death. I think the deteriorating mind holds on to stories the same way it holds on to songs and prayers. She'd think of it and she'd tell it to one of the nurses, how the Reverend Clinton Arms died in a pool of blood and peaches. I miss that old lady.